You begin in a corridor that smells faintly of rushes, tallow, and the wool cloaks that never quite dry. The castle is not quiet. It is layered sound boots on timber, a scullion clattering pitchers, the low talk of stewards measuring winter, stores. You are here because of a marriage, and in these walls, marriage is first a kind of paperwork. The poetry comes later, if at all. A castle wedding, especially among the nobility, starts with kin and calculus. You do not fall into a marriage, you are placed into it. The choice is debated by uncles, overseen by mothers who count chests of linen, and nudged by lords who look past the faces of the young to the lines on maps. Winch. If you are under wardship, a guardian may barter your prospects as easily as he trades pasture rights, with ribbons and seals. It is a balance sheet, and salt cellars, perhaps a strip of land with rye fields that toss in wind like the hem of a cloak. In return, your husband must guarantee dower your livelihood if he dies before you specified, not in sentiment, but in fractions, a third of his free land, often set out so a widow cannot be easily pushed to the margins when the great hall grows crowded with heirs. A scribe writes all of this down in a script that looks like stitching. Talk. Banns are called on 3 Sundays, naming you both, inviting anyone to speak if they know a reason you may not wed. People listen, and you listen to them listening. The silence is not romantic, it is administrative. Silence means no public obstacle, no known prior spouse, no illicit kinship obvious to the parish, no whispers of abduction disguised as elopement. It is the kind of quiet that lets things proceed. Clothes are explained to you. Your gown says something about your family's reach, the breadth of the sleeves. You are told what colors suit winter that deep woad blue holds. Up to smoke hand, what fur will not shed into your cup. A veil is more than fabric. It is a marker, a curtain showing that your household is transferring, not your body hiding. You are not a secret here. Everyone knows. The day itself folds in. The church. The ceremony may be at the church door, open to wind and witnesses, or inside if weather demands. But that threshold matters. Marriage is a public thing that leads into a private space. The vows are plain speech. You say them and are married. There is no mystery play, no secret phrase. Rings may be exchanged, though rings cost, and a blessing is said. A mass can follow. Bread is broken. You taste wine that is slightly sour, and know the year it came from by your father's harvest stories. After, the castle breathes differently around you. Men in the buttery measure ale. Women in the still room argue about rosemary. Food appears because food is how occasions are proved real. Trenchers of pottage thickened with oats. Roasted birds piled with herbed crumbs. Fish, if it is a fasting day, because even a wedding bends to the liturgical calendar. Cheeses in pale wheels. Music may come, a rebec or pipes. No one slips knives into sleeves. Then the bedding talk begins, and this is where you learn the difference between the imagined Middle Ages and the lived one. There are rituals, some places keep them, some do not. There can be a procession to the bedchamber where the mattress has been aired by the fire. People may witness you to the edge of privacy, laughing too loudly, to pretend this is delicate. In some halls there are bawdy jokes and a cup left by the bed. In others, the door closes quietly, and you are simply two people with a new arithmetic to master. The famous rite of a lord to a bride's first night is not your fate here. It is a later tale, a shadow used to slander or to sell stories. Your reality is less sensational and more enduring. Mutual obligation, recognized by church and custom, and the weight of households depending on your good health and good sense. You notice the bed. It is taller than you expect because storage chests live beneath it and fleas like heat. The mattress is stuffed straw if the year was mean, feathers if the year was kind. The bed curtains are not romance but strategy, a movable wall. Against drafts and eyes, your nightshirt scratches. A warming pan has left a thin trail of heat. Privacy, here, is a negotiated thing. Even in sleep, you will not be alone. Servants pass. Children may come quickly, or not at all, and both will be discussed by people who do not carry the consequences. Mourning belongs to stewards. The wedding gifts are written into a roll, not because anyone doubts affection, but because silver spoons wander and must be accounted for. You are taken to the strong room to see where plate is kept, to the tally sticks that remember debts when parchment is dear. A clerk shows you how he notches received and owed, and you learn the texture of obligation in wood. You will sign with a cross or a practiced hand, depending on your upbringing. But either way, you walk the buttery with the cellarer, counting casks in chalk. You visit the pantry and touch loaves to judge yesterday's bake. You learn the difference between barley and dredge at a glance, because substitutions stretch stores. You are told how much ale a day is allotted to workers, their wages partly in drink. You learn the calendar of fasting Advent, Lent vigils, because the kitchen bends to it, and you must plan menus that satisfy both God and appetite. On paper, this is dull. In practice, it keeps people alive. People teach you things in fragments. A forester speaks of coppicing cycles, and suddenly your marriage includes a hedge that will be ready for cutting in 7 years. A reeve discusses the rotation of fields: winter wheat, spring barley, fallow, and your mind begins to track time in harvests rather than months. A laundress tells you why ashes make lye and how not to burn linens. A falconer complains about a hood, and you realize leisure here is a craft too, with tools that must be maintained and budgets that can be blown by a burst seam. The church enters again in smaller ways. Confession is not a ledger, but it has entries. A priest might advise you about the marital debt, that language of obligation. He will tell you kindness is due, that bodies are not only for heirs. If months pass without quickening, remedies will arrive: herbs, advice, prayers, and occasionally the quiet suggestion that patience is itself a kind of piety. You notice the legal edges. Separation is possible, but rare, more often a matter of bed and board than bonds dissolved and annulment requires. Facts, not feelings, consanguinity, coercion, impotence, proved in ways no one wants to describe, vows made improperly. So you treat quarrels like leaks in a roof. You patch quickly because damage spreads. You learn what your dower covers and what it does not. You learn how widows hold land, how they are courted not for their faces but for the acreage that follows them like a retinue. You learn where the law bends and where it does not. Small domestic details become your curriculum. The garderobe needs ash baskets to sweeten the shoot. Someone must remember. Bed linens should be aired by midday. Someone must remind. Wax costs more than tallow, but drips less. Choose wax for the chapel, tallow for the passage by the kitchen stairs. Locking the coffer is your job because keys are a kind of power. Iron. Proof that you command stores and can deny them. You master the chain of asking. A maid asks the understeward, who asks the steward, who brings you the question, and you answer in the language of measures. 2 ells of linen, 3 pounds of salt, enough pepper to keep the stew from tasting of resignation. Letters are part of marriage, too. You dictate them, or write them if you can, to fathers, cousins, tenants, sometimes to officials in distant towns who have the authority to move carts through a market gate without additional toll. The ink stains, the wax seals. You begin to hear your household's voice in these letters, polite, careful, firm. The margins contain recipes, sometimes, or tallies quickly jotted. Parchment is not cheap. You see your life becoming handwriting, regular when mornings are calm, erratic when storms pull tiles from the roof. Not everything is grave. There is laughter here, though it is often quiet. You learn the winter joke about the cat who owns the hearth. You learn how children become ferocious when a honeycake appears. You learn which minstrels are worth their fee. Those who know stories about saints and sailors and can keep a hall attentive without stirring it to foolishness. You discover that even in castles, boredom is a craft. It is made by repetition and softened by routine, and it is what allows a community to survive the long, spare months between harvests and lambing. And always, around and under the domestic notes, is the knowledge that marriage is a node in a network. Your union points outward like the spokes of a wheel. 2 alliances, 2 neighboring lords who now count you kin, 2 disputes over a strip of meadow that suddenly matters because someone's dowry charter mentions it in a line a clerk wrote 10 winters ago. You belong to the intricate machinery of obligation, and you keep it running with the same unsung attention you give the kitchen hearth. If the fire goes out, it takes time and expense to coax it back. So you tend it daily. At night, when the hall darkens and the bed curtains are pulled and the door's latch rests, you take stock. Your day has been ledgers, linens, bands, and bread. None of this would thrill a bard, but it is the marrow of a castle marriage, a life of witnessed vows and counted casks, of lawful protections that keep widows fed and children housed, of quiet competence that no chronicle celebrates because it leaves no battlefield to paint. You realize that survival here is not a miracle. It is a practice, and yet, even with the practice, questions remain. When affection must be cultivated like a kitchen herb, how do you know if it has taken root? And what happens to a marriage and to a household if it never does? Marriage in a medieval castle was not simply the bond of 2 individuals, it was governance in miniature. A noble couple jointly presided over a living institution, tenants, servants, retainers, chaplains, and officials. Their union carried the weight of law, economy, and survival. Even the smallest decision, a grain allowance, a lease renewed, a kitchen ordered to stretch salt supplies, had rippling effects across an entire community. The wife's power was clearest in her keys. Keys meant trust, and trust meant control of resources. A lady controlled storerooms of grain, salted fish, spices, and linens. She directed the textile work that clothed household staff and embroidered banners for feast days. she trained servants, reviewed menus, and balanced gifts and expenses. Her marriage role was not quiet compliance, but daily management, visible in every corridor of the castle. The husband's work was public, martial, and often absent. He was bound to his liege lord, summoned to campaigns, councils, and disputes. While he rode to war, the castle's rhythm beat under his wife's command. Yet his return reshaped the household instantly. Treaties signed abroad turned into dinners at home, and his quarrels became her problems to host, soothe, or conceal at the castle table. Children were the most visible measure of a castle marriage. Every birth was political. Baptisms were immediate, names chosen to honor kin or patrons, and godparents selected to secure alliances. High infant mortality cast a shadow, and childlessness drew whispers. Remedies ranged from pilgrimages to relics, 2 herbs from the still room. A marriage without heirs could become brittle, threatening entire estates with succession crises. Marriage was not only between 2 people, it was between 2 webs of kin. Cousins, nephews, and distant relations swelled the castle's chambers, their presence a daily reminder of alliances and feuds. A nephew's dice loss, a cousin's careless boast each became fodder for political shifts. To be married was to live inside a web of obligations, where every gesture, even at a feast, could ripple outward into alliances or conflict. Behind the banners and ceremonies, marriage was bookkeeping. The couple's joint duty was to keep estates solvent. Rents came in coin, oats, and chickens. Bookkeepers notched tallies on sticks, recording debts and deliveries. The lady stretched grain across fasting seasons. The lord defended pasture rights in courts. Together, they balanced the books of survival. Without that balance, even stone walls could not hold back hunger. The church reinforced this partnership. Priests reminded couples of the marital debt, the obligation of conjugal fairness. Pilgrimages to saints' shrines reinforced piety, binding spouses not just to each other, but to God's oversight. Relics, bone fragments, vials of oil were household talismans of faith, reminders that marriage was sacred as much as practical. Quarrels came often. Sometimes it was a dispute over land, sometimes jealousy, sometimes raw temper. The church discouraged separation, but mediations occurred, bishops intervening, kin arranging reconciliations over banquets. The household was too important to collapse over quarrels, so reconciliation was less about romance than necessity. And yet beneath contracts and obligations love sometimes appeared. Widowers built chapels for wives they mourned. Widows refused second marriages. Letters survive with tenderness tucked among instructions about rents and mills. Love was not the expectation, but when it took root, it flavored the entire household. Still, for many, affection was a cultivated herb, tended if possible, endured if absent. When a marriage in a medieval castle reached its end, it was rarely from choice. Death cut the bond more often than quarrel or annulment ever did, then died. In battle, or from fevers contracted in damp campaigns. Women died in childbirth, or in the aftermath of disease that swept through a crowded hall. Widowhood was not a rare condition, but a stage of life most expected to reach. The question was not if, but when. For the widow, survival depended on dower rights. If contracts had been written carefully at the time of marriage, she could claim a third of her husband's estate. That third was her independence, her leverage, her shield against being pushed aside by sons or in-laws eager to seize everything. The clauses in the marriage charter became her strongest allies. Without them, she was vulnerable to being quietly displaced, shuffled into a convent, or left at the mercy of relatives. But with a secure dower, she could stand at the head of a household in her own right. Some women did more than stand, they ruled. Records tell of widows who issued charters, oversaw construction, hired retainers, and managed estates with competence that impressed even skeptical chroniclers. They were rarely celebrated as heroines medieval. Scribes preferred tales of saints or kings, but their signatures endure in documents, proof that a marriage could leave behind a woman fully in command. Of course, not every widow stayed single. Younger women especially found themselves pressured to remarry, their property making them desirable prizes in the web of alliances. Yet remarriage came with loss, freedom traded again for obligation. Many chose instead to remain unmarried, wielding their widowhood as a kind of shield. Some entered convents, turning their wealth into pious donations, exchanging one form of household authority for another cloistered kind. The success of a marriage was also judged in its children. Sons inherited, carrying forward the family's name and power. Daughters, though sometimes dismissed in chronicles, were no less valuable. They were marriage alliances in waiting, their unions forging new bonds across counties and kingdoms. But if heirs were lacking, trouble brewed. A childless marriage could throw entire estates into uncertainty, sparking succession disputes that spilled into violence. Dynastic wars often traced their origins back to marriages that failed to secure the line. This is why medieval marriage was never only private. Its effects stretched generations, sometimes centuries. The union of two people could redraw political boundaries, tilt balances of power, or ignite conflicts when inheritances were contested. One couple's children, or lack of them, could change the map. Yet, while politics and lineage were the visible outcomes, cultural memory remembered marriage in subtler ways. Literature filled with idealized love songs and satire about quarrelsome spouses shaped how people imagined wedlock. Troubadours sang of lovers whose passion soared above duty, even as real marriages remained tied down by dowries and bans. Moralists warned of scheming wives or feckless husbands. Saints' lives sometimes praised those who resisted marriage altogether, holding virginity above earthly union. Between these competing voices, the reality of castle marriage existed in the shadows, practical, demanding, and endlessly negotiated. The traces left behind were rarely romantic. They were economic and architectural. A wing of a castle funded by a dowry, a stained glass window installed by a grieving husband in memory of a wife, a ledger noting land given freely in marriage. These dull entries were the record of lives lived through obligation. The love or disappointment that colored those marriages lingers only faintly, if at all, in the margins of letters or the odd line in a chronicle. And yet, the absence of those emotions does not mean they never existed. Some marriages were affectionate, warm, and enduring. Others were strained or cold. Most were likely mixtures of both, shifting with time. The dullness of the record is not a reflection of the dullness of the life, but of what medieval society chose to write down. Paper and parchment were spent on property, not feelings. In the end, what a castle marriage left behind was survival. It fed people, secured alliances, produced heirs, and provided widows with enough leverage to endure. It was not sung about by minstrels, nor painted in glowing murals, but it shaped the daily existence of everyone inside those walls. And that leaves us with a lingering thought: when the contracts and ledgers are all that survive, do we truly know these marriages only the shadows of what was measured, taxed, and recorded? You wake in darkness, long before dawn, in a room smaller than a merchant's storeroom. The air is stale, tinged with smoke from yesterday's oil lamp, and heavy with the damp smell of plaster and dust. You are in an insula, a Roman apartment block, stacked several stories high, one of many that crowd the streets of imperial Rome. The walls are thin, the ceilings low, and everything is closer than you would prefer. This is not a villa with gardens and atrium. This is the life of the majority of Rome's city dwellers. An insula is a compromise between need and survival. The city is vast, over 1 million people by some count. Sand space is scarce. Builders throw up these blocks quickly, sometimes shoddily, using timber and cheap mortar, with brick facing only where appearances matter. The ground floors are safer, often occupied by wealthier tenants or shop fronts, while the upper floors creak under the weight of poorer families. Collapse or fire is always a danger. No one forgets the stories of sudden ruin, walls falling like dice from careless construction. But still, you live here because most Romans must. The sounds begin before the sun does. From the street comes the creak of cartwheels, forbidden by law to travel in daylight, but free to rattle past now, carrying goods from the port warehouses at Ostia. Neighbors stir. Someone coughs in the room next to yours. A baby cries in the chamber above, and its mother shushes with weary persistence. Thin walls make secrets impossible. Your life is bound up in the noises of others. When light finally filters in, it does so reluctantly, slipping past shutters that never close quite right. Your room is not luxurious. The floor is beaten earth if you are poor, cracked tiles if you are lucky. Furniture is sparse. A bed frame, or perhaps just a pallet of straw, a small table, a jug of water that tastes faintly of clay. The wealthier tenants on the first floor may have painted plaster walls, frescoes of flowers or gods, but up here, walls are bare. Decoration is a luxury when rent itself is a struggle. Rent is paid monthly, sometimes weekly, depending on your landlord's whim. The landlord himself rarely lives here. He may be a senator, a merchant, or an absentee owner with many such buildings. Collectors make the rounds, and woe to those who cannot pay. Eviction is swift, and no contract protects you. To live in an insula is to live precariously, each month's roof conditional on coin in hand. The insula is not just bedrooms. It is community compressed into narrow corridors. On the ground floor, tabernae shops open onto the street. Bakeries, taverns, cobblers, moneylenders. The smell of bread baking seeps upward, mingling with the sharper scents of spilled wine and rancid oil. People crowd these shops not only to buy, but to gossip, to trade news, to barter. Children run errands, carrying amphorae of wine or baskets of olives, up flights of uneven stairs. A man carrying water pauses often, balancing his load, cursing when a child bumps him and he splashes the floor. Water is an endless concern. The city's aqueducts feed public fountains, but only the wealthiest apartments have pipes that bring water directly in. For everyone else, the day begins with trips to the fountain, amphorae hoisted on shoulders. You take your turn, listening to the chatter. Who quarreled last night? Which baker shorted his loaves? Whether grain shipments from Egypt are delayed. The fountain is more than a necessity. It is a newsstand, a marketplace of rumor. At midday, the insula is at its busiest. Sunlight pours down the narrow street, baking the walls and filling the air with the smells of fish stalls, urine pots emptied into the gutters, and the perfume of garlands sold by hawkers. Inside, tenants cook small meals on braziers, the smoke curling through windows, staining ceilings. Fire is constant danger. A single overturned lamp can race up the wooden stairs, devouring floors before the bucket brigades arrive. You always know where your water jug is, not only for thirst, but for defense against flame. Meals are simple: bread and olives, a scrap of cheese, perhaps a thin stew. Meat is rare, reserved for festivals or feasts. Wine is diluted with water, safer than drinking straight. A shared loaf or stew pot becomes a bond among neighbors. Privacy is scarce, but solidarity sometimes grows in its place. Families borrow, lend, quarrel, reconcile within walls so thin you hear each other's breathing. Children play in stairwells or in the street outside, chasing hoops, inventing games with pebbles. They are loud, sometimes scolded, sometimes ignored. The insula raises them collectively. An older child watches the younger, while parents labor in workshops, at the docks, or in markets. The rhythm of life here is collective by necessity, not choice. When evening falls, lamps are lit, small clay vessels with wicks drinking olive oil. They cast a faint, flickering glow, shadows stretching along the plaster. Families gather, eating the last meal, telling stories, or simply sitting in tired silence. From nearby, songs drift, a neighbor singing to her child, a drunk humming tunelessly on his stair. The building creaks in the cooling air, and you are never unaware of how fragile it is, how much your life depends on timber that might burn or mortar that might crumble. Night is not quiet. Taverns downstairs spill laughter and arguments late into the dark. Prostitutes call from doorways, their voices rising and falling. Dogs bark. Somewhere, a cart rumbles past despite the ban. From your window, you see flickering torches. The night patrol of vigils roams, watchmen making their rounds. They are there for fires, for fights, for thieves, though their presence is as likely to stir fear as reassurance. And as you lie down again, the thin mattress creaking beneath you, you wonder how many more nights this building will hold. Fires, collapses, rent collectors, illness all circle constantly. Yet life continues. In the morning, the fountain will flow again. The baker will fire his oven. Children will shout in the stairwell, and neighbors will bang on thin walls. The insula endures because it must, still. One thought lingers as you drift toward uneasy sleep. How did people carve out moments of peace, love, or reflection in such close quarters, when every wall echoed with someone else's life? Living in an insula was an act of daily calculation. Every choice, where to cook, where to sleep, how much oil to burn, balanced between survival and danger. For those who lived in Rome's crowded apartment blocks, resilience was not heroic, but habitual, the practiced rhythm of people who knew how fragile their walls and fortunes were. The first and greatest fear was fire. The city was built of timber. As much as stone and a single overturned lamp could send flames climbing through floors in minutes. Every tenant kept water close, not only for thirst, but as the first defense against disaster. Regulations existed, edicts about fireproof construction, about limiting wooden balconies, about keeping stairways clear, but landlords cut corners, builders bribed inspectors, and tenants lit their braziers anyway. Smoke curled from cooking fires, lamps sputtered, and everyone lived with the knowledge that the crackle of flame could change their lives. Overnight, collapse was another constant threat. Builders eager to profit raised insulae quickly, sometimes stacking them 6, 7, even 8 stories high. The higher you lived, the cheaper the rent, but also the greater the risk. Upper floors shook when carts rolled past in the street. Rain seeped into mortar, weakening walls. In winter, when snow gathered on roofs, timbers groaned ominously. People slept lightly, aware that the building itself might betray them. Stories spread of sudden collapses, whole families buried in rubble before they could cry out. Noise was less deadly but inescapable. Neighbors quarreled through thin partitions. Taverns on the ground floor kept drunken songs going deep into the night. The baby upstairs cried. The donkey tethered outside brayed. Hawkers in the street called their wares with endless repetition. Privacy was a dream. To live in an insula was to live together, whether you liked it or not. Yet within these dangers, strategies of survival emerged. Families cooked simple meals that required little fuel, reducing fire risks. Some pooled resources, sharing a brazier rather than lighting several. Water was stored carefully, amphorae lined along walls, ready for thirst or flame. In wealthier insulae, landlords might provide cisterns or sturdier stairways, but most tenants relied on vigilance and cooperation. Community was both burden and strength. Gossip at the fountain spread warnings. Which landlord ignored repairs? Which staircase was unsafe where a recent fire had burned? Neighbors quarreled, but in danger they acted together. Bucket chains forming instinctively when smoke appeared. Possessions carried down stairwells with frantic speed. Solidarity was not born of love, but of necessity. Survival depended on collective action. Children learned resilience young. They fetched water, gathered fuel, and minded siblings, while parents worked. They grew skilled at navigating narrow staircases and dodging carts in crowded streets. Games gave way to chores, but children adapted, their laughter often cutting through the tension of cramped lives. Economics shaped resilience, too. Rent was always due, and collectors had no patience. Families scrimped saving coin for the landlord. First, food, second. Some took in lodgers, crowding rooms further, but easing the cost. Others sold labor on the street, sharpening knives, carrying loads, hawking goods. The insula economy spilled into the neighborhood. Laundry strung between buildings. Bread sold from doorways. Wine poured from street-level shops. Religion offered comfort. Small shrines, decorated stairwells, or corners dedicated to household gods. The lares, who watched over families. Neighbors might share a shrine, leaving offerings of bread, wine, or incense. Public festivals also brought respite. For a day or a week, the noise of the city turned celebratory, and even the poorest tenants joined in. Survival was not only physical but spiritual. Rituals stitched meaning into lives often dominated by danger. The vigils, Rome's night watch, patrolled with buckets and axes, meant to protect against fire and crime. Their torches flickered through streets, a reminder of both order and threat. They could rescue, but they could also harass. Tenants learned to treat them with wary respect, knowing that safety in Rome was never free of politics. For all its hazards, the insula endured because it had to. The city was too crowded, the population too vast, for villas to house everyone. Apartment living was the only solution, and so Romans adapted. They built routines out of chaos, habits out of hazards, and lives out of fragility. And yet, as night fell and lamps burned low, one question lingered in every tenant's mind. How long would this building stand? And when it fell by fire, by collapse, or by debt, where would they go? Life in the insula was rarely glamorous, but it shaped the very heart of Rome. For every marble villa on the Palatine Hill, there were dozens of apartment blocks crowding the Suburra and the Esquiline. If Rome was the capital of an empire, the insula was the empire's engine, housing the workers, shopkeepers, and laborers who made the city function. Over time, the dangers of insula living became part of Roman law and politics. Emperors issued regulations, ceilings for rent prices, limits on building heights, requirements for sturdier construction. Augustus capped insulae at 70 feet tall, and later, emperors lowered that limit again, but landlords and builders found ways around rules. Money was always the stronger force. Fires continued to devastate districts. Entire neighborhoods rebuilt again and again, testimony to both fragility and resilience. The insula also influenced the social fabric of Rome. Living so close forced strangers into communities. Families of different origins, Italian peasants, freedmen, immigrants from Syria, Africa, or Gaul shared stairwells and courtyards. The empire's diversity was visible here, not in senatorial halls, but in the crowded corridors of rented rooms. Languages mingled, cooking smells blended, traditions overlapped. Identity was less about noble lineage and more about the practical fact of surviving side by side. Economically, the insula underpinned Rome's markets. Tenants were consumers of bread, wine, oil, and cloth, keeping bakers, vintners, and weavers employed. They were also laborers, dock workers unloading Egyptian grain, craftsmen mending shoes, carriers hauling amphorae through streets. Without the people crammed into insulae, Rome's economy would have starved. Their precarious existence supported the grandeur of forums, temples, and baths. Culturally, however, insula life left little trace. Villas left mosaics, frescoes, marble inscriptions. Insula left ruins of foundations and fragments of walls. Their residents were rarely commemorated. The voices of apartment dwellers survive mostly through complaints in satire, offhand remarks in legal texts, or graffiti scratched into plaster, notes of love, crude jokes, accounts owed. These scraps remind us that ordinary Romans lived in places historians once considered too dull to notice, and yet the very dullness is what mattered. Insulae remind us that Rome's empire was not only battles and emperors, it was bread baked. At dawn, quarrels overheard through thin walls, lamps burning against the night. It was the resilience of families who endured fire, collapse, rent hikes, and noise, and still carved out daily life. They did not make headlines in history, but they made Rome possible. In a sense, the insula was Rome's mirror. Its grandeur rested on fragility, its stability balanced on danger. Rome prided itself on monuments that seemed eternal, yet its people lived in homes that could fall in a night. The contradiction defined the city. Power displayed in stone, life endured in timber. And so, as we look back, the question is not how people survived in these fragile towers, but what Rome itself would have been without them. Could the empire have stood without the anonymous thousands in its insulae who bore the weight of the city day after day? The bell rings long before sunrise, its iron tone vibrating through cloisters and echoing across damp courtyards. Monks stir from their narrow beds, rubbing sleep from their eyes as they move toward the chapel for the first prayers of the day. The liturgy comes before all else, but soon after, the practical labor of the monastery begins. Among the most uncelebrated, yet essential, is the laundry. Clothes in a monastery are not abundant. Each monk owns little: a tunic, a cowl, perhaps a pair of sandals, maybe a cloak against winter. The simplicity is deliberate, reflecting vows of poverty. Yet simplicity does not mean neglect. Garments must be kept clean, if not for vanity, then for health and order. Vermin thrive in unwashed wool. Dirt breeds disease. The monastic rules, whether Benedictine or Cistercian, stress balance labor as prayer, cleanliness as discipline. Laundry is not trivial. It is part of devotion. The laundry begins with water. Monasteries are built where water is accessible, near rivers, springs, or with channels redirected into cisterns. Early in the morning, novices fetch buckets, shoulders straining beneath the weight. The water is cold, stinging their hands as they pour it into great vats. In winter, ice must be broken before filling begins, the shards clattering into buckets. With a sound like breaking pottery. Soap is not purchased at a market, but made on site. Monks know the alchemy of ashes and fat. Ash from wood fires, especially hardwood, is sifted and soaked to make lye. Animal fat collected from kitchens or from slaughters, boiled with lye to form a rough, harsh soap, sometimes soapwort. A plant with natural saponins is used instead, crushed into the wash water to make it foam lightly. The smell of these ingredients is not pleasant, but the mixture works, cutting through grease and grime embedded in wool. Laundry days are rhythmic, set in the weekly calendar. Not every day is devoted to it. Prayer and manuscript copying, gardening, and brewing take precedence. But when the laundry comes, it dominates the cloister. Robes are collected, sorted, and carried to the wash area, often near the river or a purpose-built wash house. Wooden troughs are filled with water. Ash soap is stirred until the liquid bites at the skin, a reminder of its caustic nature. The monks scrub with vigor, their hands red and raw, fingers stiff from cold water. They rub wool against wooden boards, lifting stains, working the soap deep into fibers. There is no chatter. Silence is observed in most monasteries, broken only by the splash of water, the creak of buckets, the occasional hum of a hymn whispered under breath. Laundry is labor, but also discipline, a way of binding the body to the rhythm of devotion. Drying the garments is another challenge. Courtyards become forests of linen lines, tunics flapping in the breeze like banners of poverty. In winter, drying is slow. Clothes stiffen into icy boards before softening again by the hearth. In summer, sun does the work more kindly. The sight of dozens of habits drying in the wind is a reminder of the communal life. No possessions, no private wardrobes, only the shared rhythm of need and supply. Once dry, garments are patched and mended. Wool wears thin at knees and elbows, seams tear, hems fray. A monk with skill in needlework, often an older brother, no longer suited to heavy field labor, sits quietly in the cloister, patching with care. Every robe carries layers of repair, stories of years of wear, threads of continuity that bind generations of monks together. Some garments last decades, so patched they are more patched than original cloth. The laundry work, dull as it might appear, carries symbolic weight. Clean garments mark a clean soul. Dirt washed away is a metaphor for sin cleansed in confession. The rule of Saint Benedict does not dwell on laundry in detail, but its emphasis on humility and labor elevates even this task. To scrub a tunic is to scrub pride away. To rinse ashes from cloth is to remember the phrase spoken at Lent. Remember, you are dust, and to dust you shall return. For outsiders, the laundry is invisible. Visitors see the chapel, the manuscripts, the quiet meals, but not the buckets of lye, the aching hands, the garments stiff with soap. Yet this hidden labor is what made monastic life endure. Without it, sickness would spread, vermin would overrun, dignity would wither. The monastery's survival depended as much on its washhouse as its library. As the day ends, robes cleaned and drying, the monks return to prayer. The rhythm of laundry folds into the larger rhythm of monastic life, ora et laboro prae, and work. Work sanctifies prayer. Prayer sanctifies work. Even washing clothes becomes an offering, a dull and humble act raised to divine purpose. And still, a question lingers. In a world that valued devotion above all, did monks ever feel weariness at the endless cycle of dirt and washing, or did they truly find holiness even in the suds of ashes and soapwort? Laundry in the monastery was not random, nor was it left to chance. Like every other part of cloistered life, it followed rules, schedules, and hierarchy. Monastic life ran on order, and order turned even the humblest work into an act of discipline. At the top of the system was the cellarer, the official responsible for provisioning food, drink, clothing, and household goods. The cellarer knew the inventory of the monastery, as a steward knows the bones of his house. It was he who decided when soap would be made, when cloth needed mending, when tunics were replaced. Laundry, like bread, came under his watch, but the actual work fell to different hands. Novices, young and untested, carried buckets of water, tended fires for boiling, hauled wet garments to drying lines. Older monks supervised, ensuring silence was kept and care taken. Some monasteries assigned specific brothers to laundry duty. In larger houses, lay brothers, men not fully ordained but part of the community, bore the heavier labor. The rhythm of washing reflected hierarchy. The abbot's garments, though simple, were treated with respect. Senior monks had their robes washed first, juniors last, not out of vanity, but because the hierarchy of the cloister extended into every corner of life. Just as prayers were chanted in order, laundry too followed ranks. Organization was practical. Certain days of the week were set aside for washing. Garments were collected in bundles, each marked to ensure return to its owner. Tools were communal scrubbing, boards, buckets, vats. Each monk might mend his own robe, but the washing was collective. The sight of rows of brown or black habits drying together underlines this individuality, dissolved into community, symbolism soaked into the fabric of the work. Water was more than cleansing, it recalled baptism, the washing away of sin. Ash, used for lye, recalled mortality, the dust to which all flesh returns. A monk plunging his robe into suds was reminded of his soul, plunged into prayer, scoured of pride, raised again in humility. The mundane became a living sermon. Even the silence surrounding the wash carried meaning. Conversation was forbidden. Only psalms hummed quietly or prayers murmured. To outsiders, this silence might seem joyless, but for the monks, it made the laundry an act of contemplation. The mind was not occupied by chatter, but turned inward, finding meaning in repetition. Yet discipline could be heavy. The rule demanded order, and deviation was corrected swiftly. If a novice shirked his duty, if garments were neglected, the abbot could impose penance. It might be fasting, extra labor, or recitation of psalms. The message was clear. Laundry was not beneath the dignity of monks. Neglecting it was neglecting the community itself. The laundry also revealed the monastery's wealth or poverty. A rich house, endowed by noble patrons, might have larger washhouses, cisterns for water, soap in abundance. A poorer house made do with smaller vats, patched garments washed until threads frayed to nothing. Wealthier monasteries could afford wool of finer weave, which resisted dirt longer and lasted years more. Poorer ones wore robes so coarse and heavy that each wash stretched and thinned them. For visitors, these differences were invisible. They saw monks in clean robes, their poverty proclaimed in simplicity, not in stains. Yet within the cloister, the work that kept those garments clean was constant, disciplined, and often exhausting. And always, the task carried the question that hovered over all monastic labor: was this truly prayer in action, or was it simply drudgery given a sacred gloss? Did the brothers feel holiness as they stirred caustic lye with aching arms, or did they secretly long for relief from the endless rhythm of dirt, soap, and drying lines? The monastery's laundry might have seemed like the most ordinary of tasks, but its endurance across centuries shaped both the survival of the cloister and the health of the world beyond its walls. Washing habits, patching garments, and keeping vermin at bay were not glamorous acts of devotion, but they were foundational to the rhythm of religious life. Clothing was washed not only for order, but for health. The medieval world was rife with disease plague, fevers, lice, and skin infections. Monks, living communally, were especially vulnerable. Without laundry, vermin would thrive unchecked, spreading illness through shared dormitories. Ash, lye, and soapwort may have stung hands and ruined wool, but they killed parasites and kept skin clean. In an age before germ theory, monks nonetheless practiced a form of preventative care. Their survival across generations was due, in no small part, to the dull labor of soap and water. Monastic rules embedded this labor into the cycle of prayer. The Benedictine injunction ora et labora prae, and work made no distinction between copying manuscripts and scrubbing tunics. All was sanctified by discipline. A monk bent over a vat of suds was as much in obedience as one bent over a psalter. This theology of work gave meaning to endless laundry days. They were not interruptions to holiness, but its fulfillment over centuries. Monasteries became models of routine cleanliness. Travelers noted their order, their careful rhythms, their steady maintenance. Villages near monasteries often benefited as well. Surplus soap might be traded. Water systems maintained by monks improved local supply, and standards of hygiene spread outward. The monastery washhouse, hidden within cloister walls, quietly raised the level of cleanliness in surrounding communities. The endurance of this work also shaped European ideas of discipline. The very concept of washing as routine, not luxury, was reinforced by monasteries. While nobles might wear perfumed robes to mask dirt, monks insisted on regular washing, seeing filth not only as unhealthy but as undisciplined. In their quiet way, they carried forward the ancient Roman sense of bathing and cleanliness, preserving it through centuries when urban hygiene faltered. Even after the Middle Ages, the legacy remained. Convents taught laundry practices to novices who carried them into hospitals, schools, and orphanages. The discipline of washing as routine duty survived long after the medieval cloister declined. By the time public health emerged in modern cities, monastic laundry had already proven that cleanliness was a discipline, not an indulgence. And yet, the paradox remained. To the monks themselves, this was never about hygiene in the modern sense. It was about humility, obedience, and the symbolism of cleansing. They may not have understood microbes, but they understood sin. Washing a robe was a sermon to the soul, a reminder that dust clung not only to wool but to spirit. The laundry was, at its core, penitence in practice. Centuries later, when we walk through ruined cloisters or preserved abbeys, we see chapels, cloisters, and libraries. Rarely do we think of washhouses, yet without them, the voices that copied manuscripts might have been silenced by sickness. The prayers in chapels muted by disorder. The monastery endured because its laundry endured. And so, in the end, we are left with this thought. What history celebrates as devotion and learning was sustained by work so ordinary it was almost invisible. The survival of medieval culture rested as much on vats of lye and patched tunics as on psalms and illuminated manuscripts. Without soap and water, there would have been no schools of prayer, no libraries of learning, no continuity of culture. It leaves us with a final question. If the very survival of a civilization can depend on something as boring as laundry, how much of history is hidden in the ordinary work that rarely makes it into chronicles? The wind greets you before the daylight does. It scrapes across the valley, sharp with salt from the distant sea and dust from the volcanic soil. Iceland is no easy land, and on a Viking farm, life begins not with ceremony, but with chores. Every dawn, every season, survival depends on the rhythm of labor. The longhouse is your center. It stretches low and wide, its turf walls blending into the hillside, its roof sagging under layers of sod. Smoke seeps from the hole at the top, a reminder that the hearth is always burning, for warmth as much as for cooking. Families, servants, and sometimes even animals share this space. Privacy is rare, but warmth is shared, and warmth is the greatest wealth in this place. The day begins with the animals. Cows must be milked, their udders firm and cold in the morning air. Sheep are driven out if the season allows, their hooves clattering over stone. Horses, prized for travel across rough terrain, are fed and watered. Even chickens, scratching in the dirt, demand attention. A missed chore here risks hunger later. Every animal is more than food, is future, security, continuity. Then comes the hay. In Iceland, hay is not a crop, but a lifeline. Winters are long and merciless, and livestock cannot graze when snow buries the ground. Summer's labor is measured in stacks of hay, cut with scythes, dried in the weak northern sun, gathered into barns. Every handful counts. Too little hay, and animals starve. When animals starve, families follow. Each sweep of the scythe is heavy with the knowledge that winter is already waiting. The soil here resists. It is thin, rocky, and shaped by centuries of volcanic eruptions. Barley grows, but only just. Fields must be manured, turned with wooden plows pulled by oxen, coaxed into producing enough grain for bread and ale. Families eat coarse bread, sometimes stretched with moss or dried fish to make flour last. Meals are not feasts, but endurance. Bread so hard it must be soaked before biting. Dried fish chewed until jaws ache. Hunger is always near, always whispering. Inside the longhouse, the hearth demands care. Turf walls insulate, but fire is life. Women tend it, feeding driftwood when available, peat when not. Smoke stings the eyes and stains the beams, but without it the house chills and food spoils. Cooking is slow, stew simmering for hours, barley thickened with milk or dried fish. Pots are blackened, spoons carved from bone or wood, meals eaten from shared bowls. Every chore has layers. Milking is not only for fresh drinking, it fills skins for storage, churns into butter, curdles into skyr, a sour dairy that lasts long. Into the winter, wool from sheep becomes spun yarn, woven into cloth, dyed with lichens. Nothing is wasted. Every byproduct is bent toward survival. Even children have tasks. They gather dung for fuel, fetch water from streams, twist ropes, watch geese. Play is rare and brief, folded into work. A child's small hands are as necessary as any adult's strength. Survival is a collective effort, each person bound to the rhythm of chores as surely as to the rhythm of prayer in monasteries far to the south. The seasons dictate everything. In summer, work stretches long into the evening, every hour precious. For haying, fishing, repairing. In winter, the chores shrink but grow heavier, feeding animals in barns, mending tools, spinning wool by the dim glow of oil lamps. The dark presses close. Storms howl against turf walls, and families huddle around the hearth, passing time with sagas, with memories, with silence. From the outside, the life looks dull. Chores repeated, day after day, season after season. But, for those within, every action holds weight. To slacken is to invite hunger. To neglect is to invite death. Viking farm life was not about glory of raids or treasures, but about endless small labors that made glory possible. And as the wind rattles, the thatch and the cows low in their stalls, one question lingers over every chore. How much of survival here depended on strength of armband? How much on strength of patience? Life on an Icelandic farm in the Viking Age was not only a routine of chores, it was a daily negotiation with danger. The island's beauty masked its harshness: long winters, sudden storms, volcanic soil, and seas that could provide food or swallow boats without warning. Survival required more than strong backs. It required strategy, memory, and the solidarity of households bound tightly together. The greatest danger was winter. Long before snow fell, families counted haystacks, measured grain, and salted fish. With a nervous eye, every bundle of hay cut in summer was a promise to a cow or sheep in February. Too little, and animals weakened, producing less milk and meat. When animals failed, people failed. A single miscalculation, one late harvest, one poor drying season could ripple into hunger for an entire household. Storms brought another danger. Roofs of turf and wood leaked under pounding rain. Snow collapsed walls or sealed doors shut. Families huddled inside the longhouse, feeding the hearth with peat and driftwood, praying the roof would hold. Outside, livestock could be buried alive in drifts. To prevent this, families built shelters, small byres dug into hillsides, barns with thick turf roofs. Even so, the storm always had the last word. Fire inside the longhouse was both protector and threat. The hearth gave heat and cooked food, but sparks leaped easily into thatch. A house could burn in minutes, leaving nothing but charred beams and ash. Every family knew the risk, yet the fire never died. To live in Iceland was to accept that what saved you might one day destroy you. Resilience came from planning. Families kept stores of dried fish, hard bread, butter, buried in sealed containers, whey preserved in barrels. Nothing edible was wasted. Skins became shoes, bones became tools, sinew became thread. Children grew up learning this instinct. Not a scrap was too small to save. Survival was not just strength, but thrift turned into habit. Communal bonds shaped resilience too. Farms were isolated, but not solitary. Neighbors gathered for haying, for slaughtering animals, for building roofs. In return, they expected help. In their turn, feuds and quarrels made sagas memorable. But cooperation was the quieter truth of daily life. Alone, a family could fall quickly. Together, a valley endured. The longhouse itself was resilience embodied. Its turf walls, layered with stone and soil, held warmth against the bitter wind. Inside, animals were often stalled in winter, their breath adding heat. Families, servants, and animals shared the same smoky air, a cramped existence that smelled of wool, dung, and peat. Yet this closeness kept them alive. The architecture was not comfort but survival. Even food carried resilience in its making. Hard bread, baked, thin, and dried, lasted for months. Skyr, sour and dense, provided protein long into the cold months. Fish, salted or dried, became as hard as wood, but could be chewed slowly, soaked in whey, or boiled into stew. Meals were not feasts, they were strategies, crafted to stretch as far as possible. And then there was memory. the knowledge passed down from elders, the unwritten instructions for when to cut hay, where to pasture sheep, how to mend turf walls before storms. This memory was the farm's true inheritance. Land could be harsh, tools could break, but memory kept families alive. Still, dangers loomed always. Disease swept livestock. Volcanic eruptions poisoned fields. Trade routes failed, leaving farms without imports like salt or iron. Against these, resilience was less certain. Faith and fate mingled sacrifices at seasonal feasts, prayers to gods for good harvests, later Christian blessings. Belief itself was a strategy, giving meaning when control slipped away. Through all this, the farm endured, not by glory, but by patience. Raids and voyages made sagas, but at their foundation were haystacks, hearths, and bread so hard it cracked teeth. These were the real victories, the quiet ones. And always, one question whispered beneath the chores: was survival here truly won by strength of axe and scyther, by the silent agreements, the unseen bonds of neighbors who chose, again and again, to help one another endure? The chores of a Viking farm were not only about keeping people fed through a single winter. They built a culture, a way of life that endured for centuries. Iceland was settled on the edge of the known world, in a place where land was harsh, summers short, and winters endless. Here, survival was not dramatic conquest, but patient labor. The legacy of those chores still echoes in how Iceland remembered itself. The first legacy was resilience. Families who endured knew that strength alone was not enough. Patience mattered as much as muscle. Cutting hay in July, storing fish in barrels, patching roofs before the storm, these tasks became traditions. Their memory carried in sagas as much as raids and voyages. Heroes might be celebrated for sailing to Greenland or raiding England, but their roots were in farms where women, children, and elders kept animals alive and bread unburned. The sagas, when read closely, are filled with these quiet labors: disputes over hayfields, the fairness of pasture rights, the duties of neighbors. The second legacy was community. The farm was the unit of survival, but no farm stood alone. Neighbors bound themselves in webs of obligation, lending tools, sharing hay, helping with harvests. Iceland's famed thing, the National Assembly, grew out of this habit of collective decision-making. The chores of daily life trained people to think in terms of cooperation, negotiation, and compromise. Feuds made good stories, but the real story was the endless small acts of assistance that allowed valleys to survive famine, eruption, and storm. Religion gave chores a frame of meaning. In the pagan era, sacrifices marked the turn of the seasons. Feasts at haymaking, offerings at harvest, prayers for protection through winter. When Christianity came, the rhythm adapted. Hay was still cut, animals still milked, bread still baked, but blessings were spoken in Christ's name. The chores themselves changed little. What changed was the belief that infused them. Work was not just survival. It was stewardship of God's creation. Health and endurance also left a mark. Hard bread, skyr, dried fish, and whey formed a diet that sustained bodies through cold months. It was monotonous, yes, but nourishing enough to keep people alive where others might starve. Families learned to turn scarcity into longevity, making meals stretch, crafting remedies from herbs, and accepting hunger as a familiar guest rather than an invader. This dietary discipline left generations sturdy enough to endure. The longhouse itself carried cultural memory. Turf walls and smoky beams were not only architecture, but symbols of endurance. Even centuries later, when sagas were written down, they remembered farms not just as backdrops, but as characters: the hearth, the hayfield, the barn, the byre. To Icelanders, the farm was identity. Kings and warriors might win glory abroad, but home was measured in haylofts, in the warmth of the hearth, in bread that cracked teeth but kept families fed. And then there was law. Iceland's law codes are full of farming detail: rules about haying, disputes over grazing, fines for neglecting boundaries. Law was shaped by chores, because survival depended on fairness in farming. A man who cut hay too early risked ruining pasture for neighbors. A family who hoarded driftwood denied others fuel. Farming bred law, and law bred culture. The legacy of Viking chores reached into the future. Centuries later, when Iceland suffered eruptions, famines, and isolation, the memory of resilience carried families through. Patience, thrift, cooperation, and endurance were not virtues taught by sermons, but habits taught by chores. They became the Icelandic character: pragmatic, resourceful, and quietly stubborn. And so the story of chores becomes the story of a nation. Raids and voyages gave Iceland fame, but hayfields and hearths gave it survival. Hard bread, smoky longhouses, and shared labor kept a fragile community alive at the edge of the world. Which leaves us with the final question: if sagas celebrate warriors and explorers who truly built Iceland, the men who swung swords abroad, or the families who swung scythes at home, the sound is not of trumpets or battle, but of footsteps in rhythm, sandals and boots scuffing across stone. You are in an Ottoman Janissary barracks, not on campaign, but at the very heart of their daily existence. Here, war is only the end point of a long chain of accounts, meals, and ledgers. The empire's soldiers lived not only by sword, but by the steady discipline of porridge and pay. The Janissaries were elite, yet their lives were measured in routine. The barracks were long, plain, buildings built for function. They smelled of oil, sweat, cooked grains, and iron. Ranks of beds lined the walls, straw mattresses filled with coarse wool, blankets folded with military precision. Weapons were cleaned and hung within reach, but they were not the most vital possessions in this space. What mattered most for daily life was food and money. Every morning, the kitchen stirred to life. The cooks, themselves Janissaries assigned to kitchen duty, prepared cauldrons of porridge korba. This simple stew of grains and legumes was the foundation of barracks life. It filled stomachs, provided warmth, and reminded men of the empire's reach, as each ingredient came from different provinces: wheat from Anatolia, lentils from Syria, onions from Thrace. Even the salt was measured, counted, accounted for. Meals were eaten communally. Men sat in groups, dipping bread into porridge, sharing bowls, speaking in low tones. The act of eating together reinforced discipline. In fact, Ottoman chroniclers often remarked, "As long as the Janissary eats his porridge, he is loyal." Food was not simply nutrition, it was a symbol of order. Refusal to eat together was a sign of mutiny. After breakfast, pay was discussed. The Janissary Corps was paid in regular stipends, recorded in ledgers kept by scribes. Each soldier's name was written alongside the amount due, the entries neat and deliberate. Payment was not always in coin alone, sometimes in kindcloth for garments, provisions, or promises of arrears to be settled later. But the ledger itself was sacred. It bound soldier to sultan. As long as the names appeared, loyalty held. If the ledgers faltered, if payment was delayed or reduced, the corps grew restless. The pay was modest but steady. It distinguished the Janissaries from peasants in the fields who lived at the mercy of harvests. Even in peace, the Janissary could expect bread and porridge, coin and cloth, his place secured in the barracks. This security drew loyalty, but also made the corps political. Men with steady wages and barracks protection became a force, not just in battle but in the capital's streets. The barracks life was monotonous, but that was its strength. The rhythm of rising, eating, drilling, receiving pay, and sleeping created stability. The porridge pot was as essential as the sword rack. Without it, discipline faltered. And as you watch the scribes tally coin, the cooks stir cauldrons, the men dip bread into porridge, one thought lingers in an empire famed for conquest. How much of its power rested not on battlefields, but on ledgers and kitchens? Discipline in the Janissary Corps was built less on battlefield glory and more on the steady monotony of barracks life. The empire expected its elite soldiers to be orderly, sober, and loyal, and it achieved this not through grand speeches, but through small routines. The porridge pot, the pay ledger, the group milal were instruments of discipline. The rules were strict. Janissaries ate together, trained together, prayed together. Their meals were silent or subdued, a reminder that they were not free men, living casually but soldiers bound to the sultan. Even laughter was restrained. To refuse to eat, to leave the table, or to quarrel during a meal was not a small offense, it was an insult to the corps itself. Chroniclers recorded that when men stopped eating together, rebellion was near. Payment was equally political. The stipend, though modest, arrived with ceremony. Coins were counted in public, names read aloud, ledgers signed. The act was more than accounting, it was ritual, a reinforcement that the Sultan saw and rewarded his soldiers. The moment of pay was the moment loyalty was renewed. But if pay faltered, cracks appeared. Delays in stipend, shortfalls in rations, or careless bookkeeping could ignite discontent. The barracks grew restless, men whispering about injustice, mutiny brewing in the most ordinary of places, the mess hall. Porridge, left untouched, was not about hunger, it was protest. Refusal to eat together signaled open defiance. Mutinies often began this way, quietly. A skipped meal, a demand for arrears, a sullen silence in the barracks. Then the demands grew louder, more pay, better food, influence in politics. The Janissaries, fed and paid directly by the state, had leverage few others could claim. They were not peasants bound to land. They were armed men in the heart of the capital. When they rebelled, emperors trembled. Discipline, then, was fragile. It depended on the steady rhythm of porridge and pay. The empire knew this and worked to maintain it, but corruption, shortages, or political upheaval sometimes broke the chain. Each rebellion reminded the empire of the delicate balance between soldier and state. And so the barracks remained a paradox, the place of discipline, but also the birthplace of dissent. The same routines that bound men together also gave them the unity to resist, which leaves a lingering thought. In an empire where loyalty was measured in porridge bowls and coin ledgers, was discipline truly about devotion to the Sultanate? Was it only ever about the assurance of the next meal? The daily rhythm of porridge and pay sustained the Janissary Corps for centuries. It was a system so ordinary that outsiders often missed its power. Men who ate together, were paid together, and lived together were bound tighter than any oath of loyalty. The cauldron and the ledger were as important as the sword for generations. This routine worked. The Janissaries were disciplined, effective, and loyal. They became the Sultan's household troops, his protectors in Istanbul, and his shock troops on campaign. Their barracks were stable, their kitchens reliable, their pay steady. As long as the porridge pot boiled, the empire's elite soldiers were content. But history rarely allows stability to last. Over time, the very structures that once secured loyalty began to corrode it. Pay that was once modest but fair became delayed, manipulated, or eroded by inflation. Coins lost value, promises of arrears piled up, and soldiers grew restless. Barracks that once symbolized discipline became centers of dissent. Food, too, became political. Shortages in the empire's supply chains left kitchens strained. The refusal to eat together, once a sacred sign of unity, became a weapon. A silent meal became a louder statement than any shouted threat. As the corps grew larger and more entangled in politics, the barracks lost some of its discipline. Positions were bought, sons inherited their fathers' posts, and kitchens that once fed elite warriors now fed men who saw the stipend as entitlement rather than service. The porridge pot that had symbolized unity became a symbol of complacency. Mutinies multiplied. Janissaries marched in the streets, demanding higher pay, better rations, or political influence. They toppled viziers, intimidated sultans, and in some cases even deposed rulers. The empire that had once controlled its soldiers through ledgers and kitchens now found itself controlled by them. The decline of the Janissary Corps was not. Once bound men together, the kitchen lost its sanctity, the ledger its authority. When soldiers no longer trusted the porridge or the pay, they no longer trusted the empire. In the 19th century, the corps was finally abolished in blood during the auspicious incident. The old rhythms of pay and porridge ended violently, yet the memory remained for centuries. An empire had been stabilized by. Empires are not built on battlefields alone. They are built in kitchens, in ledgers, in the daily rhythms that hold people together. History remembers sieges and campaigns, lingers. When we measure the power of empires, should we look first at their armies on the field or at their kitchens and payrolls, where the real battles for loyalty were quietly fought? The streets of Edo, Japan's bustling capital in the 17th and 18th centuries, were full of sound vendors calling children running, sandals slapping against packed earth. But beneath this everyday noise was another rhythm, quieter but just as essential: the clatter of buckets carried on poles, the slosh of liquid waste being hauled from homes to barges, from city to countryside. This was Edo's night soil economy, the recycling of human waste into fertilizer, a system as unromantic as it was vital. Unlike many cities of the early modern world, Edo did not drown in filth. Its population swelled to over 1 million, making it one of the largest cities on earth. Yet its streets were cleaner than those of London or Paris. The reason was not advanced sewer systems, it was the careful, deliberate collection of waste. Every home, from samurai mansion to commoner's tenement, had privies. Buckets were emptied regularly by specialized workers who sold the contents to farmers. Nothing was wasted, because waste itself was wealth. For the city dweller, this system was routine. You rose in the morning, slid open the wooden door of your modest home, and stepped carefully to the privy. The bucket beneath was lined with straw to reduce splashing, its contents destined not for sewers, but for soil. Landlords arranged contracts with collectors, who arrived on schedule, hauling loads away on yokes across their shoulders. The smell was sharp, inescapable, yet accepted. This was part of life. For the collectors, waste was currency. They sold it to farmers in the surrounding countryside, who prized it as fertilizer for rice fields and vegetable plots. Contracts were detailed: which household's waste went to which farmer, how often it was collected, what price was paid. Wealthier households produced better waste-richer diets, meant richer fertilizer, and so their privy buckets fetched higher rates. Even excrement was stratified by class. The movement of waste shaped the city's economy. Barges piled with night soil drifted along rivers and canals, heading toward distant paddies. Farmers greeted them eagerly, trading rice, vegetables, or cash. Edo's prosperity rested not only on markets and merchants, but on this cycle of waste and fertility, invisible yet indispensable. The system also created order. Regulations governed collection, transport, and sale. Contracts ensured fairness. Disputes were settled not with disgust, but with law. If a collector failed to deliver, if a farmer refused to pay, magistrates intervened. What in other cities was filth became, in Edo, commerce. Yet daily life still bore the scent. Streets held privy huts, alleyways carried the stench of full buckets, barges trailed odors along canals. To live in Edo was to accept this as normal, woven into the city's rhythm like the cries of fishmongers or the clack of wooden clogs. And in this ordinariness lies the deeper story. The night soil economy was not only about waste, but about balance: city feeding countryside, countryside feeding city. A cycle that sustained one of the world's great urban centers. Still, one question always hovered. When survival depends on turning waste into wealth, does the boundary between what is valuable and what is vile blur? Does it simply vanish altogether? If you followed the buckets out of Edo's back alleys, you would see the human side of the night soil trade. Men carried yokes across their shoulders, buckets swinging and sloshing with each step, the smell surrounding them like a permanent cloak. These collectors were essential workers, though seldom celebrated. Their lives were spent in motion, balancing waste on narrow streets, moving it to barges, hauling it down canals. Without them, the city would have drowned in its own refuse. Their work was physically grueling. The buckets were heavy, each step a strain on the back. Became skilled in rhythm, how to walk without upsetting the balance, how to shift weight quickly when a child or dog darted across their path. Their clothes absorbed the smell. Their hands became raw from constant washing. Their reputation marked them as both necessary and undesirable. The risks were not just social. Buckets could spill, barges could capsize. Disease was an ever-present danger. Though waste was valuable as fertilizer, it carried contagion. Farmers who handled it knew to compost carefully, mixing it with straw and soil before spreading. Even so, outbreaks of dysentery and other illnesses sometimes traced back to careless handling. Collectors and farmers accepted this as part of the work. Danger was woven into the very economy of survival. Yet the system was highly organized. Collectors worked under contracts, often tied to specific neighborhoods. Disputes over rights could be fierce. Who had the claim to a wealthy household's buckets? Who delivered to which farmer? Who owned the barge routes? Waste was not filth to the law. It was resource. Farmers valued it as treasure. In an island nation where arable land was limited and where every harvest mattered, fertilizer was gold. Rice paddies absorbed the waste eagerly. Fields of vegetables grew rich on city refuse. Farmers competed for the rights to Edo's waste, paying good money to secure steady supplies. In lean years, when food was scarce, farmers still welcomed the bargest. They knew that next season's crop depended on today's buckets. The trade created unexpected connections between city and countryside. A merchant might never speak to a farmer, but his household waste fed that farmer's fields. A samurai's meals, digested and discarded, returned as rice for his own table. The cycle was invisible, yet binding, a silent exchange of life between urban and rural Japan. But for the collectors, the work was always precarious. They faced ridicule, the constant stench, the danger of illness. Yet they also held a kind of power. Without them, Edo faltered. Their buckets were the arteries of the city, carrying waste outward and fertility inward. And this leads to the uncomfortable truth: the health of Edo. Its size, its ability to thrive as one of the world's largest cities, depended on these men and their buckets. They lived on the margins, yet they carried the center of the city on their shoulders. So the question lingers: when a city's survival depends on the labor of its most despised workers, does society ever truly see them more, only the value of what they carry? Under its own refuse, the night soil economy was not glamorous, but it kept Edo alive. The legacy began with health. Edo was not free of disease, but compared with other great cities of its age, London with its overflowing cesspits, Paris with its reeking streets, it managed waste more effectively. By turning excrement into fertilizer, Edo reduced the mountains of filth that plagued European capitals. Farmers outside the city grew crops more reliably. Urban diets remained steady, and epidemics, though inevitable, were not worsened by waste rotting in streets, which returned as rice and vegetables to the city. Each bucket carried proof of this cycle. Merchants traded goods, samurai governed, artisans crafted, but none of their work would have mattered without food. Waste collectors and farmers stood at the root of Edo's survival. The system also reflected values in a society shaped by Confucian order and Buddhist frugality. Nothing could be wasted. Night soil was wealth because it ensured continuity. Contracts between landlords and farmers codified this, showing how even filth became property with value. But its waste fetched a higher price than that of a laborer's hut, even in excrement. Hierarchy lingered. This economy endured for centuries. Well into the 19th century, Edo's buckets and barges flowed outward and back, When foreigners arrived in Japan, they remarked with surprise at the system's efficiency. Where European cities stank, Edo recycled. The collectors, though despised for their smell, proved far ahead of their time. The legacy carried into modernity, though flush toilets and sewer systems eventually replaced buckets. The memory of the night soil trade shaped Japanese attitudes toward cleanliness and recycling. Even today, Japan is noted for meticulous waste management, separation of recyclables, and the cultural sense that every resource, however humble, has value. These are echoes of Edo's buckets, carried across centuries, and yet, what history remembers most often are not the collectors or barges, but the poets, painters, and samurai of Edo. The quiet workers who hauled buckets vanish into obscurity, their names forgotten even as their labor sustained. One of the world's greatest cities, which leaves us with a final reflection. If a civilization's survival can depend on the carrying of buckets, what other unnoticed labors of history sustained empires, cities, and cultures, yet left no names in the chronicles? Rice, millet, and wheat were the empire's lifeblood, and their steady flow into granaries kept armies fed, officials paid, and cities alive. Taxes were not only in coin, but in harvests. To understand the empire, you must follow the grain. It began in the fields. Peasants bent beneath the sun, planting millet in dry northern soils or rice in the paddies of the south. Their work was constant tilling with wooden plows, weeding, irrigating, harvesting with sickles. For each family, survival hinged on keeping enough to eat while surrendering the required share to the state. Too little, and hunger set in. Too much, and tax collectors arrived. The empire always watched the harvest. When autumn came, taxes were assessed. Officials recorded households, tallying fields, calculating yields. Families brought their share of grain to collection points, baskets of millet, sacks of rice, bundles of wheat. These were weighed and measured, not by rough estimate, but by calibrated scales, each stamped with official seals. Corruption was possible, but the bureaucracy was relentless. Inspectors checked measures, compared registers, punished fraud. Grain was too important to be left to chance. The taxes were not random. Registers listed households, their land, and the obligations owed. Bamboo slips carried columns of characters, tied together in bundles that told the story of entire villages. Clerks wrote carefully, their brush strokes binding farmers to the empire with ink as much as with law. A household that failed to deliver risked fines, confiscation, or worse. The register remembered, and the register could not be argued with. The collected grain flowed into storehouses. Massive granaries rose near towns and transport hubs. Timber frames, clay walls, roofs designed to keep out rain. Guards patrolled. Scribes logged each delivery. Seals marked every sack. Each granary was both vault and weapon, a reserve against famine, a supply line for armies, a store of wealth more tangible than gold. The grain had many fates. Some was distributed to officials as salary, a reward for service. Some fed soldiers, the empire's edge. Some was sold in markets to stabilize prices, ensuring that sudden shortages did not spark revolt. And some remained locked away, a silent guarantee that the emperor's writ could endure the next drought or flood. Daily life in this system was not glamorous. Peasants trudged to depots, officials stamped tallies, guards checked seals, clerks copied slips. Yet this boring machinery kept the empire alive. The Han did not rule by spectacle alone, but by registers and granaries, by men who knew how many bushels stood behind each city wall. And as you watch the bamboo slips tied together, the seals pressed into wax, the sacks stacked in rows, a thought emerges in an empire that dreamed of immortality. Was its true strength not in palaces or battles, but in the quiet, relentless counting of grain? Behind every basket of millet carried into a storehouse was an entire machinery of bureaucracy. The Han dynasty did not simply collect grain, it counted, verified, sealed, and archived it. At the heart of this system were the clerks and officials who kept registers. They were the empire's memory, each brushstroke on bamboo slips binding farmers to obligations that stretched across provinces. The bureaucracy was layered. Local officials recorded households and fields, noting how much land each family cultivated. Village headmen certified these numbers, forwarding them up the chain. At collection depots, scribes measured grain against official standards, stamping seals into wax or clay to show acceptance. The process was repetitive but deliberate. Every sack accounted for, every seal proof against tampering. Yet corruption always lurked. Some officials skimmed grain, falsified registers, or squeezed peasants for more than their due. Guards might accept bribes, allowing lighter sacks through. Scribes might alter records to favor friends or punish rivals. The system's very complexity gave space for exploitation. Complaints rose in petitions, some ignored, some punished. But peasants bore the weight regardless. For the farmer, strategies of survival grew out of this tension. Families underreported yields when possible, hiding small reserves in barns or burying grain underground. Others offered gifts to collectors to avoid harsher demands. Communities sometimes spread burdens, neighbors lending one another sacks to meet quotas, expecting repayment after harvests. Collective endurance mattered as much as individual compliance. The empire responded with audits. Inspectors traveled provinces, comparing records, remeasuring storehouses, punishing officials caught in fraud. Punishments could be severe: demotion, exile, even execution for large-scale theft. Yet corruption never disappeared, was woven into the grain's journey as much as carts and oxen. Taxes in grain also shaped peasant rhythms. Families planted not only for themselves, but for the state. Harvests were calculated against quotas, and survival hinged on balancing state demand with family need. Droughts or floods tipped this balance. In bad years, taxes could mean hunger, even famine. Yet remission was rare. Storehouses filled, armies marched, cities ate. The bureaucracy absorbed complaints and endured. It was not fair, but it was steady, and steadiness is what held an empire together. And so you are left with a question: was the Han's strength in the loyalty of its people, or in their weary acceptance of a bureaucracy that always, in the end, demanded its share? But they also revealed the fragility of empire. Grain taxes were more than economic policy, they were the heartbeat of the state. When the system worked, armies marched, cities thrived, and famine could be eased. When it faltered, Hunger and rebellion spread faster than any decree. Famine was the greatest test. Droughts, floods, or locust swarms devastated harvests, leaving families with nothing to eat, much less to pay in tax. In theory, the empires, storehouses existed for such times. Grain was supposed to be released, prices stabilized, bellies filled. Sometimes it worked. Emperors gained legitimacy by opening reserves, showing the people that their suffering was seen. In these moments, the register and the seal became lifelines, but other times, bureaucracy failed. Corruption kept stores locked, or transport broke down, or local officials hoarded grain. In those years, the people's anger boiled. Peasants who had carried their dues in heavy baskets year after year now faced hunger while the granaries loomed full. Rebellion followed not spontaneous chaos, but the slow, desperate conclusion of families who had given too much. The Yellow Turban Rebellion, grain taxes meant to bind empire together, could just as easily break it apart. Yet the system endured because the alternative was chaos. Registers outlived dynasties. Bamboo slips and later paper ledgers tied households to obligations that survived rulers, wars, even invasions. Grain remained the measure of power, the quiet foundation beneath palaces and armies. The long shadow of Han taxation extended beyond its own era. Later dynasties inherited the system: registers, seals, storehouses, inspectors. The details shifted: new crops, new technologies, but the principle remained the same. Rule the grain, and you rule the people of heaven. Looking back, the granaries remind us that empires rise not only by conquest or law, but by logistics. The Han is remembered for its scholars, its silk roads, its armies, but perhaps its truest strength lay in the dull precision of its registers, the guards at its storehouses, the clerks who copied numbers late into the night. And so the final reflection emerges. History often remembers the generals and emperors. But what if the true architects of empire were the nameless scribes and guards who kept the grain flowing? It did. The empire's capital glittered in mosaics and domes, but beneath its beauty lay the practical systems that made it livable. Constantinople, the jewel of Byzantium, did not survive on faith and ceremony alone. It survived on water and heat. Hidden below, fires tended within, routines of survival that allowed its people to endure both siege and winter. The city was built on hills. When armies came, the question was not whether the walls could hold, but whether the people behind them could drink, eat, and stay warm. Wells and cisterns made this possible. Rainwater ran off tiled roofs, funneled into stone reservoirs below the city. Massive underground chambers, such as the Basilica cistern, stored water in silence, their columns rising like forests in the dark. There, water was always waiting, cool and still, a hidden guarantee that the city could outlast enemies. Daily life drew from these reserves. Aqueducts brought water into the city, filling fountains, baths, and cisterns. Housewives carried jars from neighborhood fountains. Servants fetched pails for kitchens. Monks drew buckets for cloisters. Water was heavy, precious, and always watched. To spill it carelessly was to waste labor and fortune. To fetch it daily was to weave survival into routine. Heat was the second necessity. Winters in Constantinople were damp and biting, winds whipping. off the Bosporus, seeping into stone houses. Firewood was scarce and costly. Families relied on braziers of charcoal, their smoke curling through small windows. The wealthy had hypocaust systems underfloor heating in bathhouses and villas stoked by slaves who shoveled wood into furnaces. But most households huddled in winter rooms, smaller chambers sealed off to conserve warmth. And even animals sometimes shared the same heated space, not for intimacy, but for survival. Baths made warmth communal. Public bathhouses, modeled on Roman traditions, were kept alive by constant fires. Wood was hauled in carts, stacked in yards, consumed in endless quantity to keep the caldera hot. Bathing was not just hygiene, but comfort, ritual, and relief. Even when the empire strained under siege, fires for baths smoldered stubbornly, as if warmth itself was a declaration that life endured. The daily struggle for water and heat rarely made chronicles. Emperors were remembered for wars and councils, not for ordering cisterns cleaned or wood imported. Yet without those acts, the empire would have frozen or thirsted. A city is only as strong as its stores, and Constantinople's greatness lay not only in its churches and walls, but in the silent, steady systems that kept its people alive through centuries of threat. And so, beneath the glittering mosaics and soaring domes, a quieter question remains. Did Byzantium's true strength rest in its emperors and generals, or in the unseen water carriers and fire tenders? When Constantinople was besieged, its walls became famous, but its cisterns and fires decided whether the walls would matter. The city was a fortress, yes, but a fortress lives or dies, not by stone, but by supplies. For centuries, the Byzantines endured sieges that would have starved or frozen lesser cities. Their secret lay in the hidden balance of water and heat. During a siege, water was the first concern. Aqueducts, stretching across hills into the city, were vulnerable. Enemies cut them when they could, severing the fresh flow. Yet Constantinople endured because it had prepared. Vast underground cisterns, dark halls with endless rows of columns held rainwater, stored in peace for use in war. Some cisterns were open to the sky, others vaulted underground, their ceilings supported by reused marble from old temples. When buckets dipped into their depths, the city remembered its foresight, but stored water had limits. For months, the rationing began. Families filled jars from neighborhood fountains, while guards kept order. Monasteries drew cautiously from their own reserves. A city without water could not man its defenses. Fire was the second concern. Winters in the city could be bitter, winds slicing from the Black Sea. Without wood, families froze. Siege meant no firewood carts entering from the countryside, no shipments of charcoal. The wealthy had stores, locked in cellars. The poor scavenged. Broken beams, burnt refuse, even olive pits. Some winters, when fuel ran low, the cold claimed more lives than enemy arrows. Bathhouses, normally places of routine comfort, became contested during shortages. Fires were needed for soldiers, not for steam. Some baths closed, their great furnaces silent. Others remained open, a symbol that life still endured. Their smoke columns declaring defiance to the enemy camped outside the walls. In these moments, order mattered. The city's bureaucracy tracked fuel and water with the same care it tracked soldiers. Registers logged who had rights to firewood, who could draw from cisterns, which baths stayed open. Corruption crept in bribes for extra rations. The walls were only as strong as the hearths behind them. Armies might batter gates, but if citizens grew thirsty or cold, if morale cracked under deprivation, the walls themselves became meaningless. The Byzantines knew this, and so their greatest weapons were not only Greek fire or stone walls, but the quieter preparations hidden underfoot and in storerooms, cisterns full, wood stacked, ration lists ready. It is easy to imagine the empire as glory and ceremony. Yet, in truth, its endurance was measured in the mundane, whether buckets reached water, whether fire still burned, whether people could survive another night of cold and fear.